Despite its simple core mechanics and cartoony pixel art style, Celeste is a game of surprising depth, both in gameplay and storytelling, provided by a very candid portrayal of mental health issues. It's a delicate subject matter, but it sits at the core of what makes this game so special. And as such, I wanted to take a deeper dive into the world of psychology and explore not only how much Celeste gets right, but also how its themes relate to its level design and mechanics, as well as the relationship gaming as a whole has to the human psyche. For the most part, I'll be focusing on Jungian psychology for this analysis, for reasons that hopefully will become apparent as we go through the game chapter by chapter and I explain the multiple concepts at play here as they become relevant. For those who don't know, Carl Gustav Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist from the late 19th, early 20th century. He started as a proponent of Freud's psychoanalysis, but eventually diverged from it and founded a new branch of psychology called analytical psychology, which is what we'll be looking at throughout this video. And I guess now is as good a time as any to make a few disclaimers. First, I am not a psychologist, or any kind of expert on psychology, or even Carl Jung for that matter. In fact, the book I read while researching for this video isn't one of his books at all. It's called Jung's Map of the Soul, An Introduction by Murray Stein, which goes through what I understand are all of Jung's major theories about psychology. The reason I chose this book instead of something by Jung himself is that he was a very prolific author and a very hard read from what I've been told by my psychologist friend who recommended I read Map of the Soul instead. Also, I won't be going into all the contents of the book in this video, only the ones that I found to be relevant to Celeste. Second disclaimer, I won't be going into the reading of Celeste as a metaphor for transitioning. I do believe it's a very important angle to the game, but considering I'm a cisgender man and I will already be diving into a topic I'm not super familiar with, being psychology, it didn't feel right to try to tackle this topic, especially when other real people are involved. But I'll try to put some resources in the description in case anyone is interested. On that note, I also think it's important to state that while Celeste is clearly a very personal game to the team at Extremely OK Games, none of my interpretations on Madeline's psychology are meant as statements on the psychology of Maddie Thorson, Lena Rain, or anyone else at the team. Again, I'm not an expert, but even if I was, this video is meant as a literary analysis first and foremost, with Jungian psychology being just a lens for our reading of the game. Real people are a lot more nuanced and complicated than fictional characters. And as a final heads up, this video will contain spoilers and is better understood if you've played the game, so you've been warned. The very first sentences we see when starting a new save file are Madeline trying to calm herself down before the journey ahead by saying, "Just breathe." This is a fitting introduction because, as we'll see throughout the game, breathing carries an important symbolic meaning as a mechanism to counteract her anxiety attacks. The prologue doesn't have much of note in terms of gameplay, as its main purpose is pretty straightforward, teaching the player about the basics. I do like that even though it's highly likely that you won't die during this segment, this tutorial is not afraid to kill you either. It immediately lets players know that dying is not a major setback in most cases. Narratively, on the other hand, there are a few interesting pieces that serve as foreshadowing for later plot points, like the aforementioned reference to breathing. There's also this blue bird that serves as a tutorial guide, which is pretty inconspicuous at this point, but will play a bigger role as we come to understand it as part of the Old Woman in the Farewell DLC. Another interesting tidbit of foreshadowing is the Old Woman stating Celeste Mountain might show Madeline things she's not ready to see. At first it may seem like the usual foreboding warning to create intrigue for the rest of the adventure, but given the game's focus on mental health and psychology, this sentence acquires the additional meaning of diving into buried parts of Madeline's unconscious. Forsaken City is a level where all the most interesting aspects of it are put on the background. That's not to say it isn't a great level, quite the opposite, it is exactly this feature that gives it thematic depth in the context of the game as a whole. One of the most obvious ways in which this is done is through the background artwork. With its muted colors, the background doesn't call too much attention to itself, but if you turn your focus to it, you might see a few billboards related to body image and status. More specifically, advertisements for the quote-unquote ideal image of masculinity and femininity. The backstory for this place is also something that can't be completely missed if the player is not actively exploring the level, as it's delivered to us by Theo in an optional room. You're not required to meet him until chapter 3 in fact, but if you do find him here, the conversation reveals that this was meant to be a big city project, but it got inexplicably dropped before it was done because nobody wanted to live here. This could be a parallel to what many people with anxiety suffer from, starting new projects that they never finish, or it could even tie into the billboards, since trying to achieve those idealized body types is a project that often ends in frustration. Those theories might be a bit of a stretch though, as this was probably just more foreshadowing about the mysterious powers of the mountain. But the backstory remains hidden regardless. But to me the most interesting hidden aspect of this level is hidden in the background of the song First Steps. Most of the time its bass arrangement is drowned out by an upbeat, energetic melody, but in a couple of places, particularly these cliffs just beyond the city's border, the song transitions into a simpler version and becomes a lot more introspective and even a bit more melancholic. The catch is, this version of the song is part of the whole. It's always playing in the background, even in its most bombastic moments, it's just hidden beneath the surface. It's worth mentioning that you only get to hear this subdued version of the song in screens that have minimal gameplay interactions. This, to me, spells out what this first level is all about. It's Madeline trying to drown out all the bad thoughts and just focus on climbing the mountain. But the truth still lurks in the back of her mind, just like all these subtle motifs across the level's aesthetics. The song loses its more vibrant instruments precisely at the points in which there's not much frantic gameplay to distract the player. In rooms where there's not much to do, but be alone with your own thoughts. In a developer commentary livestream published a few months after the release of Ceeleste, Matty Thorson comments on the way the dynamic music for the game is used differently in each level. They mention in chapter 1 the music drops intensity when you're on a side path to give the idea that you're losing your sense of drive when you're not making progress, which seems to fit with the idea of focusing on the gameplay and shutting down all other thoughts, seeking that state of flow. In the same livestream, they comment on how the mechanics of Chapter 3 and Chapter 8 act as metaphors for the themes of those levels. So with this in mind, I think it would be interesting to try to interpret the city's main gimmick, the traffic light platforms, under these lenses as well. Given my previous theory on this level's construction being centered around the idea of keep moving and don't think about it, I think these platforms fit well not only because of their use of momentum, but also because of the few moments where you have to stand on top of it waiting for its movement to be triggered. That half second where you're just standing there, counting the milliseconds in your head in anticipation, induces a certain anxiety that seems to fit with the desire for progression and the devaluing of moments of pause and introspection. In fact, it's not until Madeline reaches the memorial at the end of the level that she finally stops to think about the risks of what she's trying to accomplish. The evil doppelganger is a very old trope. The earliest example I can think of in video games can be traced back all the way to The Legend of Zelda 2 in the form of Shadow Link, but it wouldn't surprise me if it goes even further back than that. It's a recurring motif in all of fiction because it resonates with a very intimate part of our psyches in what Carl Jung calls the shadow. In his book, Jung's Map of the Soul, An Introduction, author Murray Stein describes the formation of the shadow almost as a defense mechanism. Quote, "Every ego has a shadow. This is unavoidable. In adapting to and coping with the world, the ego, quite unwittingly, employs the shadow to carry out unsavory operations that it could not perform without falling into a moral conflict. Without the ego's knowledge, these protective and self-serving activities are carried out in the dark. The shadow operates much like a nation's secret espionage system, without the explicit knowledge of the head of state, who is therefore allowed to deny culpability." In other words, the shadow is the part of our psychology that contains all of our personality traits that are perceived as undesirable, aspects of ourselves that we don't like or don't think are valued by society. It is often something that we push to the back of our mind, so to speak, keeping it in the unconscious region. And because of that, it tends to manifest itself in dreams and emotional outbursts. Despite being quote-unquote hidden, the shadow continues to operate on the unconscious level, trying to satisfy these needs in socially acceptable ways. That being said, the shadow is not necessarily evil. It is often perceived as such by virtue of carrying the load of our most unaccepted traits, but according to Stein, often the shadow, once faced, is not as evil as imagined. And with this, I think we can start to see how Jungian psychology relates to Celeste's plot. Madeline's shadowy doppelganger, which we'll call Madeline from now on, since that's how most fans and the devs tend to call her, is a manifestation of her ego's shadow. Madeline first appears in Chapter 2, which takes place mostly in a dream version of the old site ruins. More specifically, this is Madeline's dream, and this has great significance for Jungian psychology because in it, dreams can be thought of as sort of encrypted messages from the activities happening in the unconscious. To keep a very complicated and nuanced topic brief, the human mind, as envisioned by Jung, is mostly composed of multiple psychic contents called complexes, which are usually formed in our unconscious when we go through trauma or significant life events. The ego is a sort of formative complex and is responsible for what we mostly associate with our conscious selves, our motivations and purposes. But in the unconscious part of our mind, many other complexes exist and exert influence over the consciousness of the ego, all of which have a kind of personality of their own. Any sudden burst of emotion, for example, can be a sign that one of these complexes has accumulated enough psychic energy to quote-unquote capture the consciousness away from the ego into itself. For an outside observer, it may look as though the person is acting completely uncharacteristically when in fact they're just revealing a part of their psyches that might be hidden even to themselves. When events like these happen, Jung claims the complex in question has been constellated. Think of it as a similar word to triggered, if you will. The set of complexes each of us carry in our personal unconscious varies according to our experiences, but some, like the aforementioned ego, are common structures to all of us. And as mentioned before, every ego casts a shadow, which is itself a different kind of complex that lives just outside the barrier of the conscious psyche. With these ideas in mind, we can see how Madeline's dream in Chapter 2 is the doorway through which her shadow is revealed. In this fantastic setting, Madeline is given a physical form and properties, but it wouldn't be a stretch to assume that her confrontation with that part of her has been going on long before the game starts. Even outside of her appearance, there are many ways in which Celeste's portrayal of Madeline fits with the Jungian notion of the shadow. In the prologue, the woman says the mountain will show Madeline things that she might not be ready to see, and this harkens back to the shadow being the complex that consists of our undesirable traits, things we don't want to acknowledge about ourselves. And as we discussed, the chapter following this foreboding warning kind of shoves it to the back of our minds as we get to enjoy the gameplay with some exciting music, but there are hints in both the songs and levels background of something a little less playful going on. However, it's only when we reach the end of that level that the dangers of the mountain become explicit again, as Madeline reaches a memorial for those who have perished on the climb. This immediately leads into the dream where Madeline manifests for the first time, and as we come to learn in Chapter 6, her motivation for harassing the main character is actually fear, so I think it's fair to presume that the memorial brought Madeline's doubts about her quest back to the forefront of her thoughts, which constellates her shadow complex. And where is the place where complexes usually manifest first? Dreams. And as if to corroborate that, the secret crystal for this chapter involves a puzzle in the form of a poem that plays around with the idea of dreams being a vulnerable state. In them, her heart is laid bare. The level design for the old site can be split into two types: exploration rooms laid out horizontally and challenge rooms laid out vertically. The level starts with the horizontal kind, letting the players wander around the ruins with little to no danger present. The music is mysterious, landing somewhere between haunting and beautiful. This calmness can be viewed as a sort of continuation of Madeline's pause after the events of Chapter 1. This segment is engaging in an exploratory and atmospheric sense, but there's none of that intense platforming that wouldn't let our minds wander off like we've been seeing so far. The purpose of this segment is to build tension. There's a good chance that while exploring, players will stumble upon this binocular before getting to the actual mirror, which sparks their interest in this unique item, giving them a sense of direction and anticipation. Once they reach it, a shadowy figure escapes, the music becomes a little bit more sinister, and the dream blocks are activated, allowing players to re-explore the ruins with greater access. But with no new clear direction, players are lost again, and a possible threat has been let loose, which again helps build that tension. As the level structure starts to shift to more vertical rooms, you meet Madeline for the first time. She identifies herself as a concerned observer, which seems in line with Jung's theory on the complexes that lurk relatively quietly in our unconscious until they gather enough energy to burst into the forefront of our consciousness. The chase sequence that caps off the level is also significant as a mechanical metaphor for Madeline running away from the undesirable aspects of her personality. It also differs from all the later chases in the game because there's no way for her to fight back by jumping on Madeline's head. It's almost like the mere act of coming into contact with this part of her is too painful at this moment, something that we'll see be subverted in Chapter 6 when they finally embrace each other, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In the developer stream I mentioned earlier, Mehdi Thorson lays out pretty much what the Celestial Hotel is all about. Here's what they said.
Also, the dust creatures, I felt they fit the metaphor better. Like, once we knew about Mr. Oshiro, like, we had no concept of Mr. Oshiro being in this hotel yet, or what Madeline was even doing in the hotel. But once we knew Mr. Oshiro was the focus of the hotel, it made more sense to have the dust creatures, because they represent his anxiety. And then the way the dust creatures work on cycles is like, I don't know, that metaphor to us just fits really well with dealing with someone else's anxiety and trying to help them, is you have to like fit in these cycles.
This level expands upon the theme of anxiety by showcasing an outside perspective, the accommodations that need to be made in order to engage with a person in the middle of a crisis, and how challenging this can be, especially when you haven't even dealt with your own issues yet. I think this is why throughout the game, people warn Madeline that she shouldn't make Oshiro her project. It seems like Madeline might see herself in him, and thinks that if she can help him out, then maybe she's got her own issues figured out as well. The metaphor of the dust creatures as a manifestation of Oshiro's anxieties about his hotel fit well with the objective of trying to outmaneuver it, and also how it's a harmful substance to others. But another way in which this level expresses that theme is in its non-linearity. When tasked with cleaning up the place in order to quote-unquote help Oshiro, the player is given 3 different paths that can be tackled in any order. This freedom gives the player a false sense of control over the situation, like the order in which you choose to do things can be whatever feels most comfortable, which relates to Madeline's idea that the more she cleans up the place, the happier Oshiro will be. But much like how Madeline gets progressively more annoyed at his lack of appreciation for her work, so too do the paths dynamically adjust their difficulty regardless of the order in which they are tackled, as all the clutter the player cleans up reveals more dust creatures underneath. The final stretch before reaching the presidential suite showcases the way in which Ceeleste can use longer rooms to ramp up the tension for the player. Usually challenges are contained to a single screen, meaning that death is never a big setback. But in situations like these corridors, any mistake can mean having to repeat earlier parts of the level. This can be frustrating, but it's done deliberately to place us in the same mindset Madeline is in as her patience starts to run out. All of this culminates in a clash of anxieties, so to speak. After reaching the presidential suite, but still getting ignored by Oshiro, Madeline sees how her attempts at getting through to him didn't work, and gets frustrated at seeing her projection in him. With that, her shadow is constellated once again and she lashes out at Oshiro. This passage from Map of the Soul perfectly fits this situation. The shadow is not experienced directly by the ego. being unconscious, it is projected onto others. When one is tremendously irritated by a really egotistical person, for instance, that reaction is usually a signal that an unconscious shadow element is being projected. In other words, nothing gets under our skins quite like seeing the things we don't like about ourselves in others. It's interesting that, despite being able to see Madeline as a separate entity, Oshiro doesn't differentiate between who's offending him in this scene. The logic here might be a bit muddled, but the intention is clear. Madeline is only voicing thoughts that Madeline is already having, but doesn't want to say out loud. This in turn constellates Oshiro's complex about the failure of his hotel, which similarly to Madeline makes him lash out at her. After the chase sequence is done, he's still hurt but visibly regains control over his consciousness and retreats back to his shell. If we consider Chapter 8 as an epilogue and the DLC Chapter 9 as a kind of separate story arc, the Golden Ridge marks the game's halfway point from a narrative perspective. Although lighter in story beats when compared to its neighboring levels, its placement in the middle of the story can serve as a divisor between the two symmetrical halves. The first half we start with Forsaken City, a chapter focused entirely on the climb but with hidden undertones that linger in the background. Then we get a confrontation with the shadow in the following chapter, and finally we have a third chapter where two people's anxieties clash. We'll discuss them more in depth as we go through them, but if you've played the game, you can see how chapters 5 through 7 mirror this progression. Chapter 5 also deals with two people's anxieties coming together, but unlike the case with Oshiro, Theo and Madeline work together to overcome them. Chapter 6 is a new confrontation against the shadow, but this time Madeline is not running away, she's running towards it. And finally, Chapter 7 is focused entirely on the climb again, but now Madeline throws herself at the task completely, no self-doubts and fears lingering in her mind. All of this works towards making this chapter a sort of inflection point, and with this in mind, I think this level's main gimmick, the wind, gains an interesting meaning. My interpretation is that the wind is a representation of Madeline's state of mind at this point, especially in the way it pulls her in different directions from room to room. It manifests both her desire to quit as the wind blows her back, but also her drive to keep going when it lunges her forward. This might be a good time to talk about one of Jung's later and frankly most esoteric theories about the psyche, called synchronicity. He describes it as, quote, a meaningful coincidence of two or more events where something other than the probability of chance is involved, unquote. In other words, Jung theorizes there can be connections between seemingly unrelated events even when one of these events is a psychological development in a person's psyche and the other is a material event in the physical world. He cites an example of a patient that was describing a dream of receiving a gift from a golden scarab in one of her sessions, only to be interrupted by a noise coming from the window, which turned out to be a local Swiss beetle, the closest living relative in the area to the species in the dream. Murray Stein states, quote, from instances like this, one infers that the appearance of archetypal images in dreams may coincide with other events. The compensatory phenomena cross over the commonly accepted boundaries between subject and object, and manifests in the object world. Again, the puzzle for Jung was how to account for this in his theory. Strictly speaking, such events are not psychological, and yet they have a deep connection to psychological life. Archetypes, he concludes, are transgressive, that is, they are not limited to the psychic realm. In their transgressivity, they can emerge into consciousness either from within the psychic matrix, or from the world about us, or from both at once. When both happen at the same time, it is called synchronistic. I know it sounds a bit out there to assume things of this nature are somehow connected, but this is part of Jung's work, and it's a much deeper topic than I could fit in this video. Regardless, I'm not here to pass judgment on its validity. If it helps give it credibility, this was something he developed with the help of Nobel Prize winning theoretical physicist Wolfgang Pauli. Pauli was a pioneer of quantum physics, and when you're playing at that level, relations of cause and effect don't conform to our usual understanding. So who's to say really how improbable it is that these quote-unquote coincidences Jung refers to aren't somehow related on a deeper level. Regardless, the reason I bring this up is because I find synchronicity to be an interesting lens through which we can look at levels that play with mechanics as metaphors for Madeline's state of mind, especially here at the Golden Ridge. Unlike the previous level, where the main obstacle was explicitly associated with Oshiro's anxieties, here the primary challenge presents itself in the form of an impersonal environmental hazard. There's no explicit connection between the wind and Madeline's state of mind, but it feels appropriate to assume a relationship. This is especially true for the gondola scene. When the gondola stops, it's hard to really tell what caused it in the first place. Madeline does show up, and Madeline later states that she thinks that part of her might have been the cause for the power shortage, but in the moments before that happens, we can see Madeline is already beginning to spiral into bad thoughts, which gets compounded by the lack of air in the thinner atmosphere. It's entirely possible that the wind caused the gondola to stop as a synchronistic event related to Madeline's anxieties, and Madeline only shows up because her shadow gets constellated by the event. It's Theo who helps her calm down by visualizing a feather as a way of controlling her breath. Breathing has been alluded to in the first few chapters as a mechanism Madeline uses to calm herself down, but now, with the image of the feather, it feels more concrete and will become a recurring symbol for the rest of the game. In the Golden Ridge, the old woman reminds us that the mountain can bring out anything that isn't already in you. A sentence that pulls double duty as foreshadowing for Madeline's resolution with her doppelganger, but also for the mirror temple she's about to venture into. The level design here is particularly disorienting, with many side paths that lead to strawberries, but not much in terms of progress. It forces you to engage in the exploration of this place by placing keys for locked doors off the beaten path, which also helps keep the player aware of where the next objective is and prevents the multiple paths option from becoming too overwhelming. The chapter cranks up the disorientation by introducing dark rooms with lights that need to be turned on in order to see where you're going. When coupled with some of the biggest individual rooms in the game and the aforementioned multiple path structure, the Mirror Temple is easily the most exploration-based level in the game. Given how we end up traveling through Madeline's mind in the latter half of the chapter, the lights and level structure seem to be a metaphor for exploring the deepest parts of her psyche. It's winding and non-linear and obscured by a darkness that can only be dissipated by physically going through and exploring it. The symbol of the mirror is one that has popped up twice before in Madeline's adventure, first in her dreams in chapter 2 and again in the presidential suite in chapter 3. Both times it acted as a conduit for her shadow to slip into her reality, so the association between mirrors and Madeline's subconscious has already been pre-established. When coupled with the eerie music, it creates a foreboding atmosphere that only ramps up as we first discover Theo's phone abandoned in front of a mirror, then we find him trapped on the other side of another mirror, and finally as we unwittingly venture inside for ourselves. And it's at this moment that we stumble upon one of the most ingenious uses of a tutorial I've seen in any game. The perspective shifts and the player assumes control over one of the seekers that will hunt Madeline down throughout the rest of the level. This section acts as a tutorial as it teaches us about the creature's ability to dash, how it interacts with the environment, breaking dirt blocks and being repelled by light particles, as well as getting a feel for its momentum-based movement, and in a more sinister note, their objective of harming Madeline. But it also pulls double duty as a piece of mechanics as metaphor. As Madeline explains immediately after this section, all of these monsters are coming from inside Madeline's head. They are a part of her that actively wants to do harm to herself. Her shadow says you're in control here, so it's fitting that we assume control for this tutorial and our only objective is to attack the person we've been playing as the whole time. The music for this part of the chapter is a reversed version of the song that's been playing so far, which fits well with the through the looking glass motif that's going on, but hidden in this variation are reversed, distorted whispers. When played backwards, with a female voice filter applied, we can hear the soundtrack's composer, Lena Raine, talking about her experience with anxiety and panic attacks. I think it's fair to assume she's playing the role of Madeline, or at least establishing a parallel between their experiences. Most important for understanding this part of the game, she mentions being scared of her own thoughts, which seems like the main thematic representation happening in this mirror world. In Jungian psychology, the origin of depression is usually caused by what's called a regression of libido. In this context, libido is not necessarily sexual drive, but any kind of drive at all. I mentioned psychic energy a few times so far, that's libido. Regression and progression of libido are two terms which indicate the flow of this energy that we spend in order to adapt to life and the world around us. Stein describes it as follows. The person uses libido for functioning in the world and can spend it freely on chosen activities. This person is experiencing a positive flow of energy. But suppose this person fails in an important exam, or gets shunted aside in a corporate shakeup, or loses a beloved one or a child. Progression of libido may come to a stop. Life ceases its forward momentum and the flow of energy reverses direction. It goes into regression and disappears into the unconscious, where it activates complexes. This may lead to splitting apart polarities that were once linked. They now become warring opposites. Now ego consciousness may have one set of values and principles, while the unconscious takes up a contrary position. The person is torn by inner conflict and becomes paralyzed. Later he continues, Jung noted that when energy is not spent adapting to the world and is not moving in a progressive way, it activates the complexes and increases their energy potential in the degree to which the ego loses available energy. This is the law of conservation of energy as it applies to the psyche. The energy does not disappear from the system, but rather disappears from consciousness, and this results typically in states of depression, crippling ambivalence, internal conflict, uncertainty, doubt, questioning, and loss of motivation. There is no one-size-fits-all for the cause of depression, but based on these passages we can presume that in some cases it can be traced back to certain impactful events that reverse a person's flow of energy. We can't know for sure what that was for Madeline, as her backstory is kept fairly up to interpretation, but the dream phone call at the end of chapter 2 might be a good hint that it might be related to whoever is on the other side of that line. Whatever the case may be, the regression of libido is not entirely a bad thing in Jungian psychology. Quote, while progression fosters adaptation to the world, regression leads, paradoxically, to new possibilities for development. When the inner world has been activated, a person is forced to deal with it, and later to make a new adaptation to life that takes the results into account. That movement towards inner adaptation eventually leads to a fresh outer adaptation when the libido once again begins moving in the direction of progression. But now the person is more mature precisely because of the confrontation with the unconsciousness, the complexes, personal histories, foibles, faults, and all the other troublesome and painful issues that surface during regression. These passages explaining the flow of energy in the human mind fit almost too perfectly with the plot of Celeste, especially given the events about to unfold in the next chapters. But before we move on, we need to talk about Theo. Earlier I mentioned this level mirrored chapter 3 in that both explored Madeline's reaction to other people's anxieties, and in this case, this person is Theo. In the mirror world, we not only see Madeline's depression and self-harming tendencies manifest as the eyeball creatures, but all along the walls we see eyes that are always pointing to Theo, all the while he's trapped inside a diamond-like crystal. In the conversations at the beginning of the next chapter, Theo opens up about himself, and a lot of the symbolism here becomes more obvious. He mentions he came to the mountain after feeling pressured to figure out where his life is going. Interestingly, he points out this pressure is mostly put on by himself, which matches up with what we see in the temple, a perceived idea that all eyes are constantly on him to the point where he becomes paralyzed. This pressure is symbolically represented in Theo's trap, a diamond, which only breaks once the giant eyeball guarding the temple's exit is destroyed. Mechanically, Theo doesn't do much by himself. He can help the player when thrown into an enemy and is required to solve a few puzzles where his immunity to spikes comes into play, but mostly his support of Madeline in this scenario comes up narratively. In fact, without his feather technique, she might have given in to despair long before finding him. Madeline and Theo lean on each other's strength in this chapter, in a stark contrast to the way Oshiro and her pulled at each other's weaknesses. In the end, despite getting no help from Madeline, or maybe even because of being cut off from the part of her that harbors these insecurities, Madeline is able to shut down her fears and claw her way out of the temple. This feeling of triumph and overcoming the odds without her shadow is probably what leads her to believe she has somehow outgrown that part of her as she gets ready to head for the summit. Coming off of the events of the last chapter, reflection starts with Theo and Madeline having a heart-to-heart where the player can learn more about their insecurities. Particularly interesting is Madeline's description of what depression feels like to her. She describes it as being lost underneath an ocean, which is something that will get reincorporated after her fall. But before we talk about that though, let's discuss what makes her fall in the first place. After the conversation with Theo, we are thrown into another dream sequence similar to chapter 2. This time we're introduced to the feather mechanic. At this point in the story, the feather has already been established as a narrative symbol of Madeline's control over her emotions, an idea that's now solidified even further in the form of a gameplay item, which allows the player to become weightless and fly through the level, but it's also very erratic and unstable. In that way, it's similar to the emotion we can imagine Madeline is going through at the moment. The idea that she can finally leave her shadow behind feels like a weight off her shoulders, but she doesn't realize how precarious that state of mind is. When explaining Jung's theory on the way symbols affect the flow of libido in the human psyche, Stein wrote, quote, "A symbol attracts a great deal of energy to itself and shapes the way in which psychic energy is channeled and spent. Religions have traditionally attracted large amounts of human energy, and they rely for their power almost exclusively on symbols. Through their use of symbols, they also become powerful politically and economically, but these powers are secondary to the symbolic one which undergirds them. Remove the symbolic power and the whole edifice collapses." This passage seems particularly suited to understand Madeline's reliance on the feather as a symbol of independence from her shadow, and also why she hits her lowest point when that symbol proves itself insufficient. However, this isn't meant to be a condemnation of Madeline's reliance on the feather either. This quote by Jung might help explain her relationship to this symbol. Quote, "But he who cannot lose his life, neither shall he save it. To develop the personality is a gamble, and the tragedy is that the demon of the inner voice is at once our greatest danger and an indispensable help. It is tragic but logical, for it is the nature of things to be so." Unquote. There exists a paradoxical relationship in the psychology of things that drive us to develop ourselves. Just like the wind and the sea can spell disaster for the sailor, but without them, he wouldn't ever move in the first place. At first in the dream sequence, she seems to be riding high off of her victory at the Mirror Temple, and it feels like she's now ready to leave her insecurities behind, not realizing that they're not something that can be forgotten. It's not uncommon that fighting against our emotions usually leads to some outburst eventually. That outburst is conveyed to the player as Madeline jumps out of her framing in the dialogue bubble and slashes Madeline's feather. This is effective particularly because, being so different from the rest of the gameplay, this minigame already established itself as something outside of the physical world, as an abstraction of Madeline's mind. When it gets attacked from an outside entity, it feels like an overwhelming force. This whiplash causes her to fall from her highest point to her lowest, both physically and psychologically. As her descent comes to an end, she arrives at what is one of the largest bodies of water in the game. This relates back to how Madeline described her depression when talking to Theo, and seems specially tailor-made for this connection considering there are no gameplay challenges focused on the swimming mechanics in the game. We know from the developer Q&A stream that at one point there was going to be a water level in Ceeleste, so it's hard to argue that this mechanic was implemented purely to relate back to this narrative moment, but it might very well be the reason why it was kept in the game at all after those levels were scrapped. The level design for this chapter is a callback to chapter 2 in the way that it starts with a vast area open to exploration that leads into a linear confrontation against Madeline's shadow. The crucial difference for that first part is that there's nothing to find here, aside from a crystal heart. This emptiness complements the low moment in which the character finds herself, as there are no strawberries to act as consolation prizes or diversions. All that matters is climbing out of this hole and going home. There are multiple paths that all lead to the same destination, but when playing the game for the first time, you're not sure if you're making progress or not, losing collectibles or not, choosing the easiest or the hardest paths. You're just moving forward aimlessly. It's all in service of putting the player in Madeline's point of view. After a while, Madeline meets with the old woman who finally allows her to see her shadow's true motivation. Madeline is scared. They are both part of the same mind, so every time Madeline tries to do something like climbing a mountain or helping someone else, there's a chance she'll get hurt, whether physically or emotionally. And Madeline is the part of her that uses insecurities as a defense mechanism to dissuade her from even trying. The role the old woman plays in this moment is not uncommon throughout fiction. It is the traditional old wise mentor figure. Their usual function is to help the protagonist by teaching them the skills they need for their adventure. But because Celeste is a game that deals with issues of the mind, the old woman ends up teaching Madeline a new perspective with which she can be at peace with herself. This is a very similar role to another psychic structure Jung called the anima/animus. It is traditionally divided into two based on gender, but as the discussion and understanding of gender has developed dramatically since the days when Jung came up with his theory, we can treat them as one thing. Especially because, from what I can tell, there's not really much of a functional distinction between the two. So from now on, I will just refer to it as anima. As Stein puts it, the anima is an attitude that governs one's relationship to the inner world of the unconscious. Imagination, subjective impressions, ideas, moods, and emotions. So far this says nothing whatsoever about the content of this structure, nor about gender. The usual shorthand definition is that the anima is the inner feminine for a man and the animus is the inner masculine for a woman. But one can also simply speak of them as functional structures that serve a specific purpose in relation to the ego. As a psychic structure, the anima is the instrument by which men and women enter into and adjust to the deeper parts of their psychological natures. As the persona faces out into the social world and assists with the necessary external adaptations, so the anima faces inward to the inner world of the psyche and helps a person to adapt to the demands and requirements of intuitive thoughts, feelings, images, and emotions that confront the ego. The function of helping with inner world adaptation is precisely the role the old woman is playing here, as she is the only one who manages to convince Madeline that her shadow might not be as evil as she perceives it to be. This is a notion Theo kind of hinted at in their conversation at the beginning of the chapter, but it failed to get through to Madeline. That being said, I do want to make clear that I don't necessarily think the old woman is a literal physical manifestation of Madeline's anima, in the way Madeline is to her shadow, but her image as a guide does seem to resemble that of the archetypal anima. As Madeline decides to go forward and find her doppelganger, the level design becomes extremely vertical, emphasizing her descent into the depth of her mind. On the way, she's taken into another large body of water, and this time she keeps sinking deeper and deeper until she comes across an impossible exit, where her shadow is waiting on the other side. The conversation they have has one particular line that's a very interesting callback when Madeline says, "Let's climb out of here together." This pause before the word "together" is exactly the same as what Madeline told her before the chase sequence in chapter 2. But whereas in that occurrence the word had a threatening quality to it, this time it's filled with determination. And as a reversal of chapter 2, this leads into a boss fight that's the opposite of the chase from back then. This time it's Madeline that's running away as Madeline chases after her, a complete contrast to the previous encounter, symbolizing the main character's growth. The level design continues to emphasize a downward trajectory, and the lengthy fight really seems to test Madeline's resolve, while also making evident how much effort goes into convincing her shadow. But as Madeline finally stops running, they come to an understanding and embrace each other. This is the moment that made me want to look at this game through the lens of Jungian psychology. In so many pieces of fiction, and especially video games, our shadow is something to be defeated or conquered. But Ceeleste takes a different approach, one that, to me, seems very in line with Jung's theory of individuation. Basically, Jung pioneered the idea that psychological development didn't stop at infancy, but was instead a continuous process that spans the entire life of a person. He divided life into two halves. The first one is focused on developing the complexes of the ego and the persona. Essentially, it involves becoming conscious of the world around us and adapting to it in a socially acceptable way. The persona is kind of the opposite of the shadow in that way. It contains all the qualities of our ego that we perceived as being beneficial to social adaptation, and because of that, it's generally much closer to consciousness than other complexes. The second half is where the process of individuation takes place, and it consists of integrating parts of our personal unconscious and the collective unconscious into our own consciousness. As Murray Stein puts it, quote, Jung used the term individuation to talk about psychological development, which he defines as becoming a unified but also unique personality, an individual, an undivided and integrated person. Individuation includes more than the project achieved ideally in the first half of life, namely ego and persona development. When that's done, another task begins to emerge, for the initial development of ego and persona have left a great deal of psychological material out of the conscious picture. The shadow has not been integrated, the anima/animus remains unconscious, and although it has been instrumental behind the scenes, the self has been hardly glimpsed directly. But now the question becomes, how can a person achieve psychological unity in the larger sense of the term, which entails uniting conscious and unconscious aspects of the personality? It is possible to fail in the task of individuation. One can remain divided, unintegrated, inwardly multiple into deep old age and still be considered to have lived a socially and collectively successful, albeit superficial life. Deep inner unity on a conscious level is in fact a rare achievement, although it is undoubtedly supported by a very strong innate impulse. Jung speaks of an individuation drive, not primarily as a biological imperative, but rather as a psychological one, unquote. The part I want to highlight here is what can be loosely defined as the three stages of individuation: the integration of the shadow, the consciousness of the anima/animus, and finally, the glimpse of the self. This first stage, the integration of the shadow, is what we get to experience throughout the game. While I mentioned the old woman playing the role of the anima earlier, we don't have any in-game evidence that Madeline has reconciled with her own personal anima, so the latter two stages are not all that relevant to our analysis. But I mentioned them here so that it's clear that integrating the shadow is not the end of the road for psychological development either. The process of individuation is not fundamentally a quiet process of incubation and growth. It is instead vigorous conflict between opposites. What one gains by taking up the task of facing the conflict between the persona and the shadow, for instance, or between the ego and the anima, is metal. The knowledge gained through experience of the encounter between conscious and unconscious. This conflict is what we get to play out as Madeline, and it's in this moment of embrace that she becomes whole. In a recent PAX developer Q&A, when asked what was the moment they realized they were building something special, Mette Thorsen pointed to this scene as being the moment they knew this was a meaningful story. I couldn't find any mention of Jung being an explicit reference for the plot of Celeste, but I think the similarities are pretty self-evident and, if nothing else, are a statement on the accuracy and universality of his theories on the mind's processes. This resolution also affects gameplay by unlocking a double dash ability for Madeline. It feels really natural and gives the player a whole new degree of freedom in terms of movement. I can only speak for myself, but I couldn't help but wonder what previous levels would have been like if this ability was unlocked from the start. How much easier the climb to this point would have been. But I guess this is sort of the point. This appreciation for the process of getting here is built through the challenging gameplay, much like how Madeline could never have found balance with that part of her without first coming into direct conflict with it. With both Madeline and her shadow finally on the same side, they decide once again to try to reach the summit together. Chapter 7 is by all intents and purposes a victory lap. The main conflict is already resolved and Madeline herself says she would be fine if they couldn't reach the summit even after working together. The main conflict of the story is done, but here we get to kind of live out the fantasy I mentioned earlier of revisiting previous levels with Madeline's new abilities. At least in a thematic sense, since the challenges are newly built with that power in mind. At GDC 2017, before the game had been released, Mette Thorsen gave a presentation on the level design techniques they learned while working on Celeste. At the end of their presentation, they mentioned how all the mechanics get callbacks at the end of the game. The idea was to give players a sense of how far they come when looking back at all the events they've been through, similar to looking back down at a mountain you've just climbed. In particular, looking back at Chapter 1, I personally feel a strong contrast in atmosphere from the underlying somber tones provided by the original song as compared to the energetic drive from the remixes in this chapter. The through line that permeates all these remixes of previous songs is a hopeful one, that contrasts dramatically to the more melancholic aspects hidden in the background of Forsaken City's music, establishing this final level as a mirrored reflection of that initial stage. Whereas back then, Madeline was hiding self-doubt and anxieties behind a facade of normalcy, this time she is fully committed to reaching the summit. And that's really all there is to it. What's most striking to me is how reaching the summit doesn't really have any more story reveals or major developments. The game continues after the credits, however, so I'll briefly go into chapters 8 and 9 before circling back to what makes the simplicity of chapter 7 so effective. The core served as an epilogue for the base game, a heartwarming conclusion focusing on Madeline's inner peace after a year has gone by. Mette Thorsen has stated that the central mechanic of switching between hot and cold was meant to be a symbolic representation of Madeline learning to control her emotional swings, which fits well with having to readjust your mindset for all the types of platforms and obstacles as they switch behaviors with the environment around them. Particularly interesting is the old woman's explanation as to why Madeline hasn't shown up after Madeline returns to the mountain. They've grown together, and they're not as easy to separate anymore. It fits pretty well with the idea of integrating the shadow into the conscious life as a means of furthering psychological development. Farewell came out as free DLC about a year and a half after the release of the base game, and for the most part deals with the story arc detached from the main events of the game, as it's revealed to be basically a dream where Madeline has to come to terms with the idea of the old woman's death. On a first playthrough, a lot of story elements may seem a little weird here, particularly the fact that Madeline is back, and once again in conflict with Madeline, even going so far as to abandon her for her stubbornness early on. But taking into account the aforementioned idea of individuation being a continuous process of conflict, not to mention the fact that this is all taking place in a dream manifesting Madeline's inner turmoil, this chapter's main value to our analysis is showcasing the continuation of that process. In a blog post on Extremely OK Games' website, Thorsen delineates this distinction between the themes of the base game and Chapter 9. They point out that while Celeste Vanilla was mainly about acceptance, Farewell was focused on letting go. I'll link the post in the description below and leave it at that, since this chapter feels to me almost like Ceeleste 1.5 and this video is focused on Ceeleste 1. It's totally not because I can't beat this chapter even with assist mode turned on. Surely it's not that. Anyways, earlier I mentioned how there are a few impactful story developments after the end of chapter 6 when Madeline and her shadow decide to try to work together. And I'd like to close this analysis by diving a bit more into why this simplicity is both a little odd but also kind of genius. Having a straightforward final level like that fits the narrative the game is going for, but I remember on my first playthrough wondering what, if anything, would await Madeline at the peak of Mount Ceeleste. Wondering whether the game had one more final twist up its sleeve after its lengthy final chapter. And to my surprise, the answer was not really. Madeline just sits there for a while, enjoying the sunset and the feeling of accomplishment. I think in having the final level be about the climb for the sake of the climb, Ceeleste hits at the very core reason why people gravitate towards challenging games in the first place. A recurring question that gets thrown at Madeline throughout her adventure is, why is she here? What is her motivation for climbing the mountain? I know it sounds crazy, but I need to climb this mountain, she tells Madeline in their first encounter in chapter 2. At the beginning of chapter 6, however, she admits to Theo she doesn't know why she's climbing the mountain, but she had to get out of her head. She was stuck in a cycle. Escapism could be one word to define Madeline's desire, but that's not all there is to it. Even after her internal conflict is mostly resolved, she still wishes to get to the top of the mountain. This paragraph from Map of the Soul might be able to shed some light on this topic. Quote, "The growth of the ego out of the unconscious results in a separation between ego consciousness and the unconscious matrix from which it comes. The tendency of the ego is to become one-sided, to become excessively self-reliant. When this happens, the unconscious begins to compensate for this one-sidedness. Compensations happen classically in dreams. The function of compensation is to introduce balance into the psychic system. The unconscious compensates ego consciousness over the whole life, and in many ways, by slips of the tongue, forgetfulness, or miraculous revelations, by arranging accidents, disasters, love affairs, and windfalls, by generating inspirational ideas or hair-branded notions that lead to disaster. In the lifelong unfolding that Jung calls individuation, the driving force is the self, and the mechanism by which it emerges in the conscious life of the individual is compensation. In other words, Madeline's desire to climb the Ceeleste mountain could have sprung from her unconscious as a form of compensation, which would explain why she doesn't really know how to articulate why she's so determined to do it. This all goes back to that innate drive of the mind for individuation that I mentioned earlier. Whatever the true source of her motivation may be, I can't help but see a strong similarity between it and the reasons why we play games, especially hard ones. At a first glance, escapism seems to be a fitting descriptor, but that only scratches the surface. Playing a really difficult game can be a grueling task when you're stuck for hours on the same level or boss. At that point, it gets harder to justify it as escapist fun, but we persist, maybe out of a fallacious idea of sunk cost, but maybe out of something deeper as well. I'm particularly intrigued by the correlation between hard games and mental health. And maybe you already know where I'm going with this, but it seems impossible to mention difficulty and not pay lip service to Dark Souls. But seriously, type the word Dark Souls depression into your search bar and look at how many videos talk about how this extremely difficult, bleak series of games actually help them cope in times of distress. It's not hard to think that there must be something that ties mental health and challenging game in some sort of way. The pervasive narrative I can glean from watching many of these videos is that a lot of times depression is constellated by the uncertain nature of the physical world. Whereas in video games, no matter how hard things get, the rules are consistent and therefore progress always feels within grasp. Two other interesting pieces of text I read while researching for this video can be found in the Brazilian book Clínica em Trânsito Acompanhamentos Terapêuticos, which translates loosely to Clinic in Transit Therapeutic Accompaniments. It's a collection of individual accounts by several therapists about their work in therapeutic accompaniments. Unfortunately, I don't think it's been translated to English, so every quote from now on will be a loose, unofficial translation by myself. The two texts in question are specifically focused on patients that had a close relationship with gaming. One is called Journey, Accompaniment in the Virtual Desert, and the other is called The Camper, both about young men who had difficulty relating to other people and found solace in video games. The first text is about Felipe, a 27-year-old who was living a reclusive life focused almost entirely on gaming. The account starts when Felipe, a fan of indie games, gives the author his controller and prompts him to play the 2012 game Journey. Felipe refused to explain anything about the game beforehand and instead chose to watch as his therapist figured things out for himself. The author describes Felipe's interest in watching him play the game as uncharacteristic of their previous interactions, which started in the first place as a request from Felipe's mother, not himself. Because of that, the therapist's presence in his life was initially seen as a bothersome intrusion. The relationship between therapist and patient is always fairly one-sided, the author points out, and in the text we come to learn Felipe had issues with being misunderstood, which led him to mistrust people who try to impose different lifestyles onto him. But as Felipe invites the author to play the game, a role reversal takes place. Suddenly, the therapist becomes inexperienced and must rely on intuition to go through the adventure. The interpretation that the text brings is that this invitation to play Journey had deeper unconscious connotations for Felipe. It was also an invitation and acceptance of the author to fill the role of his therapist, while also making a statement on the terms in which he wishes that relationship to be constructed, something based on intuition and equality. The second text, The Camper, is about Bruno, a teenager with speech impediments and motor disabilities related to complications at birth. Because teenagers are the worst, he's bullied at school, doesn't have many friends, and much like Felipe, spends most of his time immersed in video games. Bruno also interacts with his therapist through games, specifically Call of Duty in this case. He taught the author how to play, but eventually fell into the habit of camping in order to win games more easily. His therapist notes this behavior coincided with him starting to retreat more into his shell, lying during their sessions and keeping quiet, leaving the therapist in the dark about developments in his life school. He enrolled in his school as part of a program for kids with disabilities, but that meant that the school never really challenged him in any way. There was a kind of presumed cognitive disability pinned on him, which the therapist suspects might have been presumptuous on the part of the school, given that at a certain point in the text, Bruno starts taking chess classes, becomes really good, and places second on a tournament. The thing is, much like his playstyle, Bruno took advantage of the easy curriculum he was presented with, never leaving his comfort zone until graduating. It was only in the following years that Bruno actually decided to start applying for colleges and thinking about what kinds of jobs he wanted, and coincidentally his playstyle in Call of Duty changed. The game had become easy and a bit boring, so he stopped camping and started placing himself in more dangerous situations, like using knives and pistols only. It was also around this time that he took chess lessons like I mentioned earlier. Maybe even more so than in Felipe's case, we see a person that retreats into gaming as a coping mechanism against life's hardships, but develops a relationship to it that also allows them to express feelings that are sometimes too hard to verbalize. As an interactive media, games are uniquely positioned to allow for that kind of player expression. What these texts indicate to me is that the games we play and how we play them can act as extensions of our personalities and psyches. There are valuable lessons to be extracted even out of the most lowbrow gaming experiences, and they have real-world applicability. I don't think this was necessarily done intentionally, but to bring things back to Ceeleste, this is a game that seems to understand that on some level. Ceeleste is an exploration on the nature of challenges. Mechanically, it can be an extremely difficult game, and as we've seen, the ways we interact with the game have a tendency to mix with our own inner struggles. Ceeleste goes one step further by actually basing its plot around the themes of psychological struggle and development. Nowhere is this more evident than in the hunt for the strawberries. The game outright tells you that they don't do anything. It can be comfortable in telling you that because it knows that the kind of player that enjoys Celeste is the kind of player that will appreciate the challenge for its own sake. Another way in which the game does that is through assist mode. When you first turn it on, it states in no uncertain terms that Celeste is meant to be a challenging game, but it's also a game about acceptance. And acceptance involves understanding yourself, your preferences, and your limitations. With that, the developers can trust that you won't spoil the game for yourself with cheats. They know you're not here to pretend you got to the very end for meaningless bragging rights. You're here for the intrinsic value that playing through a game can provide. Which is why having the Summit chapter be a straightforward race to the finish line is a genius move. Challenge for its own sake is meaningful, and after everything we've been through, we know that. Another way to put it, in the words of Granny Celia, funny how we get attached to the struggle.